the way it works, kind of as I mentioned at the start, is like it gives your muscles or your cells more energy, but you have to use that to lift more weights or go harder in the gym to get the benefits of creatine. If you just take creatine and expect to get bigger and sit on the couch, it's not going to happen.
Hey team, welcome back. This is the third time I've said this because Alex's live-in girlfriend won't stop talking in the background of the episodes. Welcome back to another week of Mops and Mo's. Drew and Alex here, and his girlfriend in the background. I'm building a boat
Ooh, what kind of boat?
in my garage, a rowboat. So here's the thing. I live on a lake. I've lived on this lake for 3.5 years. There's an island in the middle of the lake. This makes it sound like a very big lake.
Is there treasure on the island?
No, but in my head, I thought it would be cool someday to take my daughter to the island and camp on it, which
That'd be
makes
really
this
cool.
lake sound huge. It's not that huge, but like there's a little. So anyway, decided to build a rowboat, bought the plans for said rowboat, didn't realize that the company that sells these plans is from like the 1950s and they haven't changed
Mm.
their plans since the 1950s. So I have full scale rowboat plans on my floor in my house, written in a language. It's English, but it's 1950s English. That makes no sense. So,
Weirdly, I also know a guy who built a boat for
oh,
his kids and stuff.
Noah?
No, it's not Noah. Richard definitely does not listen to this podcast, so there's zero chance he'll hear any of
Shout
this.
out Richard, fellow
Um,
boat builder.
but I don't know. I mean, if you want whatever plans he used, I've been
No,
in
these are
that boat.
fine.
I have rowed that boat. It works. It is very
A lot of
heavy.
a lot of metaphors. Yeah, this one's made out of mostly plywood. It's called an imp. It's an imp
Mm,
boat.
it's a
But
weird name for a boat.
I'm gonna name it the Flying E.
Mm, for Edie.
Daughter's name's Edie. Yeah, so there you go. She wants to name it Cupcake, and she wants me to paint it rainbow colored. Probably not gonna
Why
do.
why doesn't she get to name it if it's for her?
I don't want to. We'll see what happens when we get there. But I'll make my maybe I'll make my Instagram public for a little bit, and people can follow along in the boat building journey.
You could compromise and keep it like mostly natural wood, but like little sprinkles painted on periodically around it.
That's not a bad idea.
Mm.
Plywood just doesn't look great unpainted, and you have
Yeah, I
to
was gonna
paint
say,
it.
so like Richard's boat is not plywood, it's like nice wood and it's like
Yeah,
very polished and looks fantastic and stuff. But the downside is it's ridiculously heavy.
it's really heavy. Yeah, especially if you do like fiberglass.
I don't like he and I like loaded it on the trailer and unloaded it, and with two people it's fine, but like I don't know, like one person loading that would be rough.
Thankfully, if people follow along and strong, they'll be strong enough to lift
Mm.
a boat by themselves.
Look at that
Um,
ad.
Actually, speaking of getting really strong, today's episode is very relevant. Who are we talking to?
It sure is. Great transition, Drew.
Thank you. From boats to creatine.
There it is. Maybe that's the episode title. Who knows? Today's guest is exceptionally qualified to talk about creatine to the point that you can find references to him on the internet being referred to as Dr. Creatine. Scott Forbes is an associate professor in the Department of Physical Education Studies at Brandon University in Manitoba, Canada. He's also an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Health Studies at the University of Regina, also in Canada. Dr. Forbes is a certified sports nutritionist through the International Society of Sports Nutrition and a clinical exercise physiologist and high performance specialist through the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology. Dr. Forbes has published over 110 peer reviewed manuscripts and 5 book chapters. Frankly, that number has probably gone up since I looked it up. Like not that long ago, it was 92, then it was 110. He just keeps publishing. His research examines various nutritional and exercise interventions to enhance muscle, bone, and brain function in a wide variety of populations, everything from athletes to aging adults. And just to quickly run down the list of academic credentials here: bachelor's in kinesiology from the University of Saskatchewan, master's in kinesiology from the University of Saskatchewan, PhD in physical education and recreation from the University of Alberta, postdoctoral fellowship with the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Calgary, and International Olympic Committee diploma in sport nutrition.
I don't know where any of those places are in Canada.
Saskatchewan's fun to say, though.
It is fun. You said it well. Is it safe to say that this episode came about because they said they were going to put creatine in MREs?
Yeah, I think it pretty directly was the result of that.
So for
And
people
to
that
be
don't know,
fair, I don't know what's going to happen with that because that like appeared in like a House report on a draft version of the NDAA that hasn't been passed. I have been doing some posts on NDAA language because there's a version that has passed the House. I did not check if the most recent version included the creatine part, but I did search like the term nutrition as one of the various terms I search as I go through the thing, finding anything relevant to human performance. And I did not see the creatine language still in there, so that the ship may have sailed with the creatine left back on shore. It may not be on its way to your MREs, but interesting to know that discussion is out there.
Sure. And I think the takeaways from this episode are namely that creatine is very good for you.
Yeah.
And as attested to by the number of articles he's published, it's very, very well researched. So
Mhm.
for people that have been around training for any period of time, I would hope that they would at least know what creatine is in some sense. But if you don't, today's episode, hopefully by the end of it, all your questions will be answered. So buckle up, make yourself a protein shake, dump some creatine in there, shake it around. What else do you have?
I was just going to say before we roll into the episode, you'll hear in the episode, I acknowledge this, but I did change my opinion from something expressed on social media. And I have acknowledged on social media that I did change my opinion. It does happen once in a while, exposed to
Mm.
new evidence, change your stance. When I first saw the news about creatine and MREs, I thought it was stupid because my whole
It is kind of
understanding,
stupid.
I mean, to some degree, there's some dumbness, but we've done dumber things. My initial thought process was everything I know about creatine says effectiveness is largely based on achieving saturation, which means you have to take it consistently over time. Putting it in MREs, people eat those not consistently. They eat a bunch all at once over a short period and then don't eat them for a long time. Not a great way to see the kind of benefits we would traditionally look for from creatine. But as we discussed in the episode, there was some research I wasn't aware of at the time. Saw a paper come out this past February. Scott like points out in the episode that that was not the first paper to find that information, but it was the first paper I had seen to find that creatine has pretty impressive benefits on mitigating the consequences of sleep deprivation on cognitive performance. And this most recent paper specifically identified that it has that effect even in single dose. So there might be a case there that we can like maintain shooting accuracy and other types of tasks like that, despite the inevitable sleep deprivation of combat operations by putting some creatine in MREs. So who knows?
And get jacked.
And get jacked.
So with that, enjoy this week's discussion on creatine. Speaking of very important people, I did want to ask you, Dr. Creatine, like, did you make that up or where did that come from? Sounds like an evil superhero.
Yeah, it's just kind of fallen upon me based off of kind of the research that I've been doing. So
Do you have like a superhero costume?
I have a t-shirt. Yeah.
There we go. On the topic of extremely important questions that we should get out of the way at the top, and I don't know if it makes a difference that you're Canadian on this one, creatine or creatine?
Creatine.
Okay. We're going to stick with that for the rest of the episode.
Creatine. Who was it? I was listening to somebody. It might have been Bio Lane.
Yeah, it might have been Lane Norton. I'm pretty
Lane
sure you're saying
Norton was
creatine.
on, yeah, creatine on Peter
Yeah.
Attia. Okay, creatine. That's fair. Okay. So I know before we hit record, we started talking about how we were going to ask dumb questions. And so I'm going to start with the dumbest one of all. Will you just explain what creatine is for people?
Yeah, creatine is obviously a steroid.
You inject it.
First and foremost, just hugely anabolic. No, it's made up of 3 amino acids. So anytime you consume protein, you're consuming amino acids. And yeah, if you put those 3 specific amino acids together, arginine, glycine, and methionine, it creates this molecule called creatine. And kind of the usefulness of that is once it gets into a cell, it gets converted into phosphocreatine, and that's stored potential energy. And that particular energy system is good for really producing energy quickly, or ATP, and supports kind of high intensity exercise. So it's just basically an energy system that you're creating when you consume creatine.
I'm curious, just sort of on a personal level, because I mean, obviously being around this space for a long time, creatine, the supplement, like everybody, no one really knows what it does, but everyone knows it exists and they know you take a scoop a day, whatever. But Can you explain like the history of it as a supplement? Like when did people start putting it into a powder form and taking it as a supplement?
Sure, yeah. Actually, quite a long time ago. So actually in 1832,
Holy
it was
hell.
first it was first isolated.
Huh.
And then the first supplementation study that was published was actually in 1926. So
Wow.
that's when it took them about 100 years to get brave enough to ingest it. But yeah, the supplementation studies have been going on for almost 100 years. And it took until kind of the 1990s when there was a few professors, Roger Harris and Eric Altman, they kind of started the whole creatine kind of world, supplementation world, because they showed that most of it is stored in the muscle. They use muscle biopsies. So they take a chunk of muscle out and then show that some of it gets converted into that phosphocreatine. And yeah, if you supplement with about 20 grams per day for 5 to 7 days, you can actually saturate your muscles with creatine, or you can consume a little bit lower dose of creatine for longer periods of time. But they were the first to show that in the 1990s.
So in the 20s, when they were starting to do research on this, and I mean, maybe in even the 1800s, was it from a performance perspective or were they doing something else with it?
They basically, the first study in 1926 was just showing that their bodies were retaining the creatine.
Huh.
So they're measuring kind of a byproduct of creatine metabolism in the urine and looking at the breakdown of that. And they showed that when they started to ingest with creatine, that byproduct didn't increase in the urine. So that's suggesting that it was actually staying within the body somewhere. And then over time, that byproduct marker started to go up, suggesting that kind of it balanced itself out and taking more and more doesn't necessarily just store into the body.
Hmm.
People who are listening are probably not as interested in like the history and logistics and of it stuff. We're going to talk about the performance and health parts of it in a second, but I am a little bit curious from like a supply chain standpoint. It seems like a lot of the creatine I see on the market is all like the Creapure creatine, which all comes from Germany, if I understand correctly. Like to to what degree is there a difference in different creatine products we buy on the shelf? Because it seems like it's all just different labels of imported like Trostberg Creapure.
Yeah, so that's one of the main kind of manufacturers in the world is Creapure in Germany, and they support a lot of research. So pretty much all the research I've done on creatine supplementation has been supported by that particular manufacturer. There are other manufacturers in the world that create creatine, but yeah, Creapure it seems to be effective based off the research, and it seems to be very safe as well. I'm sure there are other forms of creatine that you can get, and other places where you can get creatine monohydrate from, for example. But I can't really speak about the purity of those particular manufacturers.
So why is it that creatine, like why are people so curious about it? Because it's talked about all the time. And when you do even just a little bit of research, you quickly find, phrases like, oh, this is one of the most well-researched supplements we have. Like, do you know where that came from? Why is it such a hot thing?
I think because it's one of the few supplements that works, and a lot of
That's
people
fair.
respond to it. So you can get creatine in your diet. Like you don't need to supplement with creatine, and our bodies can create creatine as well from different kind of protein sources.
Mhm.
Our kidneys and liver can put those three amino acids together, but it does so at a limited rate. And as I mentioned, you can get it in food, but it's also challenging to get a lot of creatine from those food sources. They're mostly they're animal based. So if you're vegan or vegetarian, you tend to be actually a bigger responder to creatine supplementation. But almost everyone responds a little bit to creatine supplementation. So I think that's why it's just been a kind of a popular supplement to study. It's science. It's nice to get a supplement that actually works. There's so many supplements that do absolutely nothing and have no effect. So I think it's just kind of garnered a lot of attraction because of that.
You mentioned that a lot of people are likely to respond to it. And as I'm sure you're well aware, research tends to talk about averages. We tell people like what to expect in terms of effect size and this works or this doesn't work, but it's usually more complicated than that. For creatine specifically, do we see a pattern of like non-responders, super responders? How common is that? And like, how do you know? And I'll tack on an asterisk to this of like how common are the GI distress issues, because that seems to be similarly distributed.
Yeah, for sure. So pretty much everyone will respond at least a little bit to creatine. There's actually a nice study looking at responders, and they call them non-responders to creatine and actually semi-responders. Um, so they looked at a sample of individuals and they took muscle biopsies to measure how much creatine was getting into the muscle. Also did performance tests as well. And they showed that people who had the largest kind of increase in the amount of creatine gains following the supplementation in the muscle also had the greatest benefits from a kind of a performance standpoint. But there were a few individuals that had really small increase or basically no increase in creatine supplementation within their muscles. And it was actually associated with a couple things, but one was their fiber type distribution. So if they have more fast twitch fibers, those are type 2 muscle fibers. So humans kind of have different types of muscle fibers. You either have slow twitch or fast twitch. Slow twitch are like, if you think of like marathon runners, for example, they'll have a lot of slow twitch fibers. Fast twitch fibers are like sprinters or bodybuilders. So if you had more of the fast twitch fibers, you tended to be more responsive to creatine supplementation. And then also, depending on your baseline level. So if you had lower amounts of creatine in your muscle to begin with, you tended to be more responsive to creatine supplementation. That's why we think vegans or vegetarians actually respond better to creatine supplementation than those that consume those creatine-containing foods and have a little bit more in their muscle to begin with.
Is it like, so with creatine, because I know we're talking about kind of oversaturating all of those things. Does it work the same way that something like testosterone might, where when you take more and more of it, your body kind of loses the ability to produce it naturally, or is there no conflict?
In humans, in the kind of the recommended doses, there's no conflict. And the reason why we know that is because if you stop taking creatine, uh, your creatine levels will slowly decline, but they'll go back to where they were previously. So they're not going to like go down any further. There is some animal research to show that if you take like a huge amount of creatine that's not possible in humans, it is possible to slow down the endogenous production of
Mhm.
creatine. But in humans, yeah, that's not being translated.
I was gonna ask, I'm glad you mentioned animals. Have you ever seen a human like overdose on creatine? Could somebody overdose on creatine?
There's a couple case studies that are published in the literature. One individual is consuming over 200 grams of creatine per day,
Holy
and then
shit.
they had some kidney issues. So they obviously linked those two things together. But yeah, that's a little bit higher than the recommended doses.
I'm trying to think, because 5 grams a day is kind of like what typically, you go to the store, you buy your creatine, it's in the little thing, and you have the little scoop. 5 grams, 200 grams of that. I'm trying to figure out how you would do that in a single day. That's a
Yeah,
lot.
that's 40 scoops of creatine.
Holy shit.
So there is a possibility to overdose on anything, and yeah, you can definitely overdose on creatine.
Jesus. Okay, so I know we'll link this in the show notes, but there was a paper that came out that you were a part of, and there were sort of a bunch of common questions and misconceptions about creatine. And I know you probably get tired of talking about this all the time, but since you're here, I want to run down the list. I want to ask you these and I want to kind of shoot holes in them based on your findings. And feel free to riff on whatever directions you want to go in. And we'll start at the top. Does creatine lead to water retention?
So it does a little bit over the short term, but that's actually a good thing. It actually stimulates the muscle to grow. And but over the long term, you might have a little bit more water within your body, but that's because you're also going to have a little bit more muscle mass. So muscle itself is about 75% water. So if you just have more muscle, you're also going to have a little bit more water as well. So it doesn't cause some people think it causes dehydration,
Of
which
course
is
they
kind of
do.
crazy because, and then there's other people that are like, oh, it causes just water retention. That's all it does. So you're like, what? How can it do both? But they're both kind of wrong in that aspect.
Is there and this may come up multiple times, but for water retention type stuff, is there like a difference when it comes to gender? And I ask that because one of the things I really hear when you mention maybe females taking creatine, well, I don't want to retain water, I don't want to get bulky. And then men seem to be less troubled by that because bulky equals, the t-shirt's going to look tighter. Is there a gender difference at all?
Possibly. And there's actually there was one really cool study by Abby Smith Ryan. She's a great researcher in the US, and she looked at creatine supplementation across the menstrual cycle and showed that there was a little bit greater water retention in the luteal phase compared to the follicular phase of the menstrual cycle. So there could be associations with kind of estrogen and estrogen's impact on creatine kinase, which is the enzyme involved in creatine metabolism. So yeah, so there might be differences between males and females, and then it also might depend on phase of the menstrual cycle as well.
I'll ask the question exactly as it is in your paper, but then I'll add to it. Is creatine an anabolic steroid? And then to go with that, do people need to cycle on and off of creatine?
So as I mentioned kind of on the outset, yeah, it's definitely not a steroid, even though people say that all the time. And it will make your muscles bigger. So maybe that's the relationship between steroids and creatine. I'm not too sure why people put those things together all the time. And then to answer the second part of your question, you do not need to cycle on and off creatine. You can take it daily for years and years, but you can also cycle on and off if you want to, because once you go off creatine, it takes about 4 to 6 weeks to return back to baseline. So you can go off of it for 4 weeks and probably be perfectly fine. So yeah, that's a strategy maybe to save money for people that don't want to be on the supplement all the time and want to save a little bit of money.
That leads me to a few different like sub questions. I guess the first one is, do you think the like internet stuff about cycling on and off of creatine just came from the same place as thinking creatine's a steroid?
Reddit.
Possibly, yeah. Or kind of one of the previous questions is that if you take creatine, that it's going to suppress endogenous productions of creatine.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe people are a little bit fearful of that and saying like, okay, like go on creatine, that's okay, but go off of it because you need to allow your body to like go back to normal and not, be expected to get creatine all the time from the exogenous sources. So yeah, I'm not too sure why people say that, but yeah, it could be associated with creatine or with steroids, but yeah, I don't.
Tied to that, and you've alluded to the loading phase where you like take a higher dose to saturate your muscles more quickly. For the normal daily gym goer kind of person, like not any particular like goal they have in 1 week or something, do you consider the loading phase like that important a thing, or would you just put them on the 5 grams? And then tied to that, with the 4 to 6 weeks to return to baseline level, does it really matter if you miss a day here and there then?
So if you're not concerned about getting kind of the benefits right away, just take 5 grams a day. Super simple. There's a little bit less side effects. So I know you previously mentioned that maybe associated with responders, non-responders, is there people that get some side effects associated with creatine? There are a few people, it's relatively rare, but some people get a little bit of kind of upset stomach or GI distress with taking creatine, and particularly with that loading dose. So if you take 20 grams per day, you're going to have kind of greater GI distress. But so if you're not concerned about getting benefits right away, just take 5 grams per day. And then of course, if you just miss 1 day or 2 days, it's not a big deal. And we actually did a study looking at looking at all the studies that just took creatine on training days. And in those studies, they trained 3 times per week, and it was just as effective as taking creatine every single day. So that's another strategy that people can try, is just take it on the days that they're training. If that helps with consistency over time, then at the end of the day, it actually makes no difference.
So I guess it's relatively flexible so long as you don't do 200 grams a day, is what it
Yeah,
seems like.
20 grams is definitely too much.
I was about to ask you the next one, but then since we were talking about anabolic steroids, just out of curiosity, have you ever run into anybody that's injecting creatine? Because I could see some meathead just like syringing it up and sticking it in their butt.
No, but I did see a study where they're creating like a nasal spray. So that was kind of interesting to me. I was like, are you suggesting that we snort creatine?
No, that's
Yeah,
pre-workout, not creatine.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's creatine's very well absorbed, and you definitely don't have to snort it. You can just mix it with a little bit of water and drink it, and you're going to get it into your bloodstream, and most of it's stored in the muscle.
Just doing some random Googling while we're here chatting about it to see if there's anything on injectable creatine.
Oh, Jesus.
They have used injectable creatine in animal studies, specifically to track it crossing like the brain barrier and things like that.
Yeah, I'm sure there are, yeah, but don't do it. It's not necessary.
So can you speak a little bit to, maybe this is a misconception specifically about kidney damage and or renal dysfunction when it comes to creatine? Because I've heard that one a bit too.
Oh yeah, I hear that a ton. So if you ingest creatine, you're gonna have more creatine in your body, and creatine is broken down non-enzymatically, so it doesn't require an enzyme. It just like naturally breaks down into creatinine. So that's a byproduct. And in a normal situation, if you go to the doctor's office and they're worried about how your kidneys are functioning, they'll measure that in the blood. They'll measure creatinine, and if that value starts to go up, then that can indicate that like something's wrong with your kidneys. But if you're supplementing with creatine, creatinine will naturally increase. But a lot of people get concerned because that's associated with kidney dysfunction. So there's other markers that people need to kind of suggest to their physicians or doctors when they're getting kidney function tests done if they're on creatine. There's one called cystatin C that they can get assessed, or they actually need to measure creatinine clearance through the kidneys. So not just in the bloodstream, but also in their urine, and see how their kidneys are actually clearing that creatinine. Yeah, a lot of people say creatine causes kidney damage because it elevates creatinine, but they need to look at other markers.
What is like the most annoying, and maybe we'll get into this as we keep going through this list, but I'm curious because I assume kidney dysfunction is one of the big ones, but like what's something that you see where you're just like, please shut up?
Hair loss.
Oh, that was the next question.
So I gotta ask the question, but I also gotta put a disclaimer on it. So
I
I
interrupted
have to
Alex.
ask it. I have to ask it because it's in your paper, but like the listening audience won't see you. We don't keep the video from these interviews, but they will probably have seen a picture of you on the like thing to click on or whatever. He's bald. Like for people listening, Scott has no hair.
It's because of
So
creatine, isn't it?
so his answer to this question may or may not be defensive. I'm not sure we could totally trust him on it, but does creatine cause hair loss?
Yeah, and well, obviously, if you can see that I have no hair. Also, my good friend, collaborator, Dr. Darren Candow, has not a single strand of hair on his head. Dr. Jose Antonio, creatine user, researcher, good friend, no hair. So we all have no hair. So we're not really the
Recovering
best guys.
creatine users.
But there's no evidence to suggest that it actually causes hair loss. Where this came from was actually a study in rugby players where they showed an increased conversion of testosterone to dihydrotestosterone, or DHT. And DHT has been linked to male pattern baldness. So that's basically the one study that showed that. I don't even understand the mechanism, how it would actually increase that conversion, but they did show that. There's a few kind of limitations with that study. It was relatively small. The changes in those hormonal values were also pretty small. And if you look at it, the creatine group does increase a little bit, but actually the placebo group drops. And I don't know why that would happen. There's actually a difference at the end of the study between the placebo group and the creatine group, and that's what they've kind of caught on to. And people are like, it causes baldness. So to that end, there's actually a researcher in Iran who's just started a creatine hair loss study. So they got a hair doctor on board, and they're going to give half the participants creatine, half placebo. And they're like taking pictures of hair follicles and measuring everything associated with hair loss.
In
And they're
Iran.
going to find out if creatine actually causes hair loss.
I didn't realize Iran was a hotbed of creatine research. Go figure.
I think they do a lot of things there, but yeah, they do some research as well. So I'll send you the image of the
Yeah.
creatine hair loss study. So they sent me the first participant, the
Nice.
follicles of the hair, and they were like, "We're doing it." And I'm like, "That's awesome."
Even just like looking at the mechanism, are you aware of any even attempts to replicate that study? Because you said you don't like understand the mechanism of how that would even happen based on creatine in the first place, and there might have been something else going on with training or who knows what else, sleep, whatever it is, stress. Has there been any attempt to reproduce that result? Because that's kind of
No,
interesting.
that's science. No one reproduces things.
Yeah, and because there's no mechanism to kind of like suggest it, I'm not don't know anyone who's tried to replicate that particular study. So
Hmm.
Do you see that a lot? And we've asked this question in various ways to various researchers, but with your sort of perspective on, I guess we'll call it sports performance, like surely it has to be infuriating when you see a study like that and it's a singular study, but it just becomes like it snowballs. And then here's you trying to do all this work, maybe to attack the misconception, but maybe just to generally broaden the understanding. Like, do you see that a lot?
absolutely.
How frustrating is that?
It's incredibly frustrating, but yeah, it's important to look at the methodology of the studies. It's important to look at what we call meta-analysis, where we try to
Mhm.
combine individual studies together because yeah, one study could show something, a very similar study can show the opposite thing, but you try to put these things together and come up with like overall what is the actual effects of creatine. So yeah, I've
Mhm.
been involved with kind of a lot of systematic reviews and meta-analysis where we try to come up with like the totality of the literature. What does it actually say? Because an individual study, there's always a little bit of bias.
And then just one Joe Rogan episode snags that one study, and next thing you know, creatine makes everyone bald. Jeez. What about age? Children, adolescents, harmful, fine. What do you say?
So I answer that kind of two ways. One is in scientifically, it's safe for children and adolescents to consume creatine, and there's actually quite a bit of research to show that it's effective in adolescent populations to enhance exercise performance. But kind of the second way I answer that's kind of my personal opinion is like maybe we shouldn't be focusing on supplements in adolescence. So we should be focusing on just like good nutrition, learning how to cook, sleep, train. All those things are much more important to focus on than supplements. But there is some evidence that it can be effective.
Well, you're speaking to a military audience, and we'll get into creatine and MREs here in a little bit, but I would argue that literally zero people want to do the sleeping and the eating. They just want the
Hmm.
supplements.
I think at the risk of going down a rabbit hole there, I think as a guy who runs like a social media platform that looks at fitness and human performance issues, the audience gets much more engaged on topics of being able to buy something than they do on something that's going to require consistent habits. And I think that might, I mean, you're in the supplement space, you talk about this all the time, but like compare effect sizes between even something that does work like creatine and like getting a full night's sleep. And like the unsexy things start to look a lot more effective.
Yeah, there's no real secrets in life. It's sleep, eat, lots of fruits and vegetables, whole foods, and just exercise regularly. If you do those three things, you're pretty much 95, 99% of the way there. So
Well,
yeah,
if you take creatine, you'll get to 100% is
yeah,
what I'm hearing. And you'll be huge.
yeah,
You'll just also be
absolutely.
bald.
Yeah.
So speaking of like potential drawback, that was a question brought up in your paper. Does creatine increase fat mass?
So yeah, that's kind of another thing that I've seen on social media as well. Just because you might gain a little bit of body mass, so you're going to gain some weight if you take creatine. Most of that obviously is muscle, but some people thought that you would also increase fat mass as well, but we've actually shown the complete opposite. Although the effect size is very small, so it's not the if you're trying to lose fat mass, this is not the strategy to do it. But it's also not going to help. It's not going to put on fat mass. So yeah, you don't have to worry about it.
So people just assume that because they're getting bigger, it's a fat mass thing.
I guess so, but that's a bad assumption.
It's interesting you say that because I was talking earlier today about the conversation we were going to have tonight with one of my strength coaches, and they mentioned that taking creatine makes them feel like a blowfish. So, I guess there's that too.
Yeah, completely untrue. I don't know. People say things like that all the time, like it just causes water retention, all that stuff. But
Well, let me
yeah,
ask you this because, and I know this wasn't necessarily in your paper, but we mentioned at the top most of the creatine coming out of Germany, and there's different sort of products. Have you seen? I'm assuming the answer is yes, but like surely there's some manufacturers that just do shady stuff with their supplements. You can get higher quality versus lower quality. Have you seen instances where lower quality creatine can create some of these misconceptions that people feel, and it's just a matter of the quality of the supplement itself?
for sure. Yeah. So like anecdotally, like people will say like, oh, I get like really bad GI distress or like feel horrible when I take the creatine. And yeah, I asked them like, what brand of creatine is it, And recommend Creapure. That's what most of the research is based off. That's what I've used quite a bit. And if they use that, then they tend to feel better on it. And I've seen that, yeah, quite a bit on social media as well.
Is there a benefit of taking creatine for the older population? And I guess follow-on question to that would be like, where do we see that crossover in age where the prescription is the wrong word, but where that might change?
So the answer is yes, it works across the lifespan. So it's a benefit for older adults. We just did another meta-analysis where we just updated our previous ones. We showed that it does help older adults when it combined with resistance training to put on muscle mass. And it also improved their upper body strength, but different compared to our previous meta-analysis. We actually showed no significant effect on lower body strength in older adults when combined with resistance training. So yeah, so the effect size is definitely very small, but it did seem to improve upper body performance and just overall lean tissue mass or muscle mass.
And I know you just mentioned there that was with resistance training. Is there a world where just creatine alone increases those strength markers, or does it have to be coupled with resistance training?
We tried, so we looked at a review with just creatine and no exercise, and there was a few. There was 11 studies that were published that looked at that, and 7 of the 11 studies showed at least one improvement in some sort of exercise performance. But again, when we combine all the studies together and we look at that, it has to be combined with exercise, particularly to get bigger muscles.
Mhm.
And yeah, to get those muscle adaptations, you have to combine it with exercise. So the way it works, kind of as I mentioned at the start, is like it gives your muscles or your cells more energy, but you have to use that to lift more weights or go harder in the gym to get the benefits of creatine. If you just take creatine and expect to get bigger and sit on the couch, it's not going to happen.
That absolutely makes a ton of sense in terms of measuring performance outcomes in terms of like fitness measures and things like that. But it seems like recently in particular, the narrative around creatine has shifted a little bit to start talking more and more about the cognitive component of the whole thing. And before I ask you any specific questions, what have you seen so far in the literature in terms of creatine's usefulness for cognitive measures?
That's definitely an emerging area of research. And as I mentioned, about 95% of creatine or most of the creatine in your body is stored in your muscle, but there's other areas in your body that have creatine, for example, your brain. And there is some evidence that if you take creatine, supplement with creatine, you can increase the amount of creatine within your brain. But it's much more variable and the effect is much smaller than what happens at the muscle level. So you might get like a 5 to 10% increase in the brain, whereas the muscle, it's like 20 or 30% increase. So the effect is much smaller. There's also certain situations where kind of brain creatine levels tend to go down. And that's where you might see some benefits of creatine, such as sleep deprivation, mental fatigue, hypoxia. So in those situations, I think there's kind of a more robust effect of creatine on impacting cognition in those situations. We actually looked at, again, a review. In older adults, it seemed to be of benefit to enhance memory, but in younger adults, it had no effect. And we thought maybe it was associated with dose. So we also did a dose response study in a younger population and gave them either a placebo, 10 grams per day, 20 grams per day for 6 weeks. And we actually found no effect of the creatine on any of the cognitive function tests that we did in that younger population. So if you're a younger individual, just you're not stressed, you're not sleep deprived, you're probably not going to get any cognitive benefit from creatine. If you're older, if you're sleep deprived, mental fatigue, maybe in those situations you could get some benefit from creatine.
So, given that our audience is largely military, your line there about younger adult, not stressed, not sleep deprived is probably not going to apply. They're probably both stressed and sleep deprived. And one of the studies that caught my eye recently, and I don't want to make you do like a lit review live on air, but I'm guessing you have read the study, is the February of this year piece on single dose creatine improves cognitive performance and induces changes in cerebral high energy phosphates during sleep deprivation. Is there other research to back up what this particular study found? How plausible do you find the mechanism in the study? What do you think?
Yeah, so there are other sleep deprived studies. There's 3 or 4 studies that have been published. Another one was in rugby players. They actually looked at passing accuracy. So in a normal situation, if they got a lot of sleep, they're quite accurate at passing the rugby ball. If they were sleep deprived, their passing accuracy went down. But if they took creatine, even when they were sleep deprived, their passing accuracy was maintained. So in a sporting situation or for military or tactical, I think it's like kind of important that you want to be accurate in certain situations. Creatine, even in a sleep deprived state, could be a benefit. There's 2 other studies that I'm aware of in older population where they showed when they're sleep deprived that if they took creatine, it helped their cognitive function. And then this one came out and got a lot of attention, but I was like, yeah, this has been done before and not really a surprise to me. I guess the single dose was kind of the surprise that, it didn't take any loading phase or any kind of longer term dosing protocol. It was just a single dose of creatine still had an impact, even if you're sleep deprived.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because that was going to be my follow-on question about that one in particular. And again, probably specific to the military audience. My thought would be that the layperson would hear that and think to themselves, the less sleep I get, the more creatine I should take to sort of balance that out. And what you're saying is, well, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but maybe irregardless of the amount of sleep deprivation you're dealing with, it's single dose. Beyond that, there's no added benefit or no?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I don't know if you're more sleep deprived if that requires a higher dose of
Like
creatine.
5 grams for every hour or something?
Yeah, that's a good question. I should definitely look at that.
Did we just
But
create a research study on creatine? Let's do that.
okay, we can do it. I'll write up the ethics right away and get that going.
I know a good population that has nice samples of people at various levels of sleep deprivation. We'll call the Army whenever you're ready.
Totally, but that's an interesting question for sure. I guess I don't know the answer. I don't know if there's a different dose depending on the level of sleep deprivation, but maybe the more sleep deprived you are, the more creatine you need.
And
The most I would go is about 20 grams per day. Definitely do not try 200 grams per day and not sleep forever because you'll damage your kidneys and have other associated problems. But and then also just to mention to your listeners, like sleep is necessary. So important for
listen,
so many
we've been
things
saying that for years.
you can't just sleep less continuously and up your dose of creatine.
I'm going to put
at
you on
some
the
point, you
spot.
gotta sleep.
I'm going to put Dr. Creatine on the spot. Which is more important, sleep or creatine?
Oh, Jesus.
That's a tough one, but yeah, I have to say sleep. Sleep's the most important thing. I went to some nice presentations a couple of years ago on sleep, and yeah, they convinced me that sleep is actually kind of essential.
All right, we're gonna clean out the rest of the list of questions from your paper that we haven't hit, and then we're gonna, I think, turn to some tactical specific kind of stuff. But returning to fitness measures, we'll put sleep deprivation and cognitive performance and things aside. Within fitness performance, is creatine only useful for like the classic ATP PC type of activities, strength and power, explosiveness, sprinting, stuff like that?
The bulk of the literature is definitely on that and shows that it is really effective. We think that it could also be effective in endurance performance as well, particularly if you involve higher intensity bursts of activity in that endurance performance activity. So like there's a study in cyclists, for example, that were doing a 120-kilometer time trial. They every 10 kilometers they did like a 1 kilometer and a 4 kilometer sprint. And they alternated that for the 120 kilometers. And they showed improvements in the last 1 kilometer sprint and 4 kilometer sprint when they're taking creatine. So even in that endurance activity, there's possibly some benefits of taking creatine to be a little bit more explosive. So I think it could be a benefit for other activities as well.
Well, as you start describing bursts of intensity during lower intensity steady state endurance stuff, you're starting to like pretty accurately describe realistic tactical scenarios. So hopefully people are paying attention to that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point.
Have you seen, I mean, because sort of preparing for this episode is when I first started to see, with your work and with others, kind of the conversation around creatine with endurance, because historically I'd always seen it associated with strength power, like Alex mentioned. I guess my first question is that a relatively new body of research? And then maybe as a follow-on, is the endurance community, have they been receptive to creatine? Have we seen more creatine in that space? Because every time I've been around that type of world, you hear oh, it's going to make me bloated. It's going to slow me down, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, so they're definitely less receptive to creatine, but there has been research that's been going on for about 20 years in that area. But it's definitely not as much research compared to the strength kind of bodybuild muscle benefits of creatine. So yeah, there's just less research on it. There's also some research to show that it could be detrimental to endurance performance. For example, there's one study that was actually published in 1998, so a few years ago now, but they did a 6 kilometer run, and they showed that when they took creatine, they gained body mass, and then their performance went down in that running race. So that could have implications as well. And so there is some evidence that it could be bad. There's evidence that it has no effect. But I think in certain situations where you need to kind of do really high intense bursts of activity, in those low kind of intensity, longer duration exercises, that's where you'll see the benefits of creatine. But if you just do continuous exercise, it's going to have no benefit. But yeah, that was kind of our rationale, and there are a few studies to support that as well.
Okay, I think this is towards the tail end of your misconceptions paper, but again, another word we mentioned kind of at the top, creatine monohydrate. Can you explain that? Is there similar stuff, more superior stuff, more inferior? Can you just sort of go through the different, I guess, quote unquote types?
Yeah, so there's a lot of alternative forms of creatine. There's like creatine HCl, there's buffered forms of creatine, there's creatine monohydrate. And so traditionally, and most of the research has used creatine monohydrate, but there's lots of claims. You go into a supplement store and they'll suggest like these alternative forms are better, they're better absorption, less GI distress, or whatever they try to claim. But if you actually look at the research, there's no evidence to support that they're superior in any capacity. And so the evidence suggests that creatine monohydrate is kind of the best. And there's a couple good reviews on that area as well.
What are some of the reasons why a brand, like why would you come out with some variant? Is it cheaper to produce, or like what's the logic?
They sell it for more money and they
That's
make
fair.
up some claim, and it's just different. So the
Yeah.
creatine monohydrate world is quite saturated.
I pulled off one sub question from your paper and I want to ask it on its own because it's going to lead me to a topic that's uniquely relevant to the military. Is creatine stable in beverages, in solution in water?
So no, it is not. Yeah, there's actually a company that had super
Yeah,
creatine in
he's
it.
going there already.
Yeah.
I'll set him up a little bit because he's trying to be
It's called
diplomatic and
Bang.
stuff. The military is very aware of Bang Energy. The military loves their energy drinks. It's a whole, this is not part of this conversation, but I just saw a video yesterday of a dietitian in the army having to work with a soldier who was consuming 15 energy drinks per day.
Holy shit.
So the military is very aware of energy drinks. I
What
don't know if
brand?
I don't know. I didn't go down that rabbit hole. We'll figure that out in a separate conversation.
15?
But I'll lay out what I know of this whole super creatine thing. You probably know way more than me because you're Dr. Creatine, but you can fill in the gaps. As
I love that.
I've always been confused about this because Bang Energy said super creatine on the can. But if I open a Bang and pour it into a glass, there is no precipitate at the bottom of the can. You don't have to shake it before you drink it. So
Precipitate for
clearly,
folks means like sand at the bottom of your
yeah.
glass.
And so I guess some of my questions, it seems the jury in the courtroom decided that whatever it was that they're calling super creatine just wasn't, like, it wasn't doing anything, and now they have to stop saying it. And not only do they have to stop saying super creatine, they have to stop claiming that there's creatine in the product. But like what was the thing they were trying to call super creatine, and what was going on there?
So they did put creatine in the drink, but it's broken down quite rapidly in liquid form into creatinine.
Mm.
And so they had people ingest this drink, and then they measured the amount of creatine in the bloodstream, and it did not change at all. So basically, that was enough evidence for the courts, I guess, to basically say that, yeah, this is a false claim.
Hmm.
Super creatine.
I don't know if Bang is still the thing anymore. The military, like, soldiers move on very quickly to new
Prime is the
preferable
thing now,
forms of
right?
energy drinks. But isn't Prime in trouble with the
I don't
Olympics?
know. Isn't
Like, there
Prime the
was,
Jake YouTube
yeah,
guy?
I already know too
No.
much about Jake Paul or Logan
Jake
Paul
Paul.
or
That's
whoever it
yeah, the
is.
Paul guys.
I don't want to learn any more about that. But I did see that there was like a lawsuit with like Team USA suing Prime over use of something during the Olympics. I don't know. Conversation for a different podcast.
Can you put creatine in coffee?
This is actually a really important question.
That's my own question.
This is an important one. And like
Thank
more
you.
specific,
Is it?
like,
I just was
can you put
curious.
creatine in coffee? You obviously can. The real question here is, do creatine and caffeine
Oh yeah, that's
negatively
fair.
impact each other's effectiveness?
There's a little bit of evidence that, yeah, it has a small negative impact. So if that's your way to take creatine and you enjoy doing it that way, and you take it consistently that way, it's probably fine. But if you're trying to maximize the benefits of creatine, I suggest to take creatine and caffeine at different times. So we actually did a training study. There's 4 groups, 1 placebo, 1 caffeine alone group, 1 creatine alone group, and 1 creatine and caffeine group. And the creatine group got bigger muscles over time, and the creatine caffeine group got a little bit bigger muscles, but not to the same extent as creatine alone. So suggests that maybe there's some opposing effects, and there's a few kind of ideas why that might be, but yeah, so that's my recommendation. So if you want to take them
Can
together, it's probably fine. But yeah, if you want to maximize the benefits of creatine, take caffeine before you exercise in your Bang energy drink or whatever your energy drink is these days, and then take creatine after you exercise.
you put like a ballpark percentage number on difference in effect size there? And this is totally not because I got in an internet argument with a dietitian about caffeine and creatine a couple weeks ago.
Sounds like it.
Like
Yeah.
the negative impact of creatine caffeine.
Yeah, like
Is that what
how much of a difference in that, like, in the study you referenced?
Very small.
Okay.
So we actually measured, like, we used an ultrasound to measure changes in muscle thickness. And we did that at your elbow flexors, so your biceps, the most important muscle in your body.
Of
We
course.
did triceps, elbow
Second.
extensors.
Second most
We
important.
did it leg extensors, leg flexors, and at the calf as well, your plantar flexors. And only the knee extensors was there that negative interaction. So one of the outcome variables showed that. All the other outcome variables, there was actually no difference. So yeah, I would say overall, it's like I wouldn't be of major concern of putting a little bit of creatine in your coffee that you're going to lose your gains. But there is that really small effect in at least the knee extensors that we saw in that particular study.
Can we haven't, I mean, I think we've hit on this briefly, but specifically kind of shifting gears into it, there is evidence of creatine being beneficial for post-concussive sort of rehabilitation, but then also kind of recovery in general. Can you just speak to those two prongs, I suppose?
Yeah, so there's actually there's one or two studies in children or adolescents, I guess. So they actually it was ages 1 to 18 where they
One?
had concussion. Yeah, I know. So
How many
it's pretty
one-year-olds
young,
have
but
concussions?
I, I I guess so. That's what they reported in the study, and I'm
Jeez.
not 100% on how they actually evaluated some of the outcomes in a 1-year-old. But they did show some improvements in some of the recovery symptoms if they took creatine. But that particular study was an open label study. So the participants knew that they were receiving creatine.
Mm.
So that could definitely impact the outcomes. And that's a major bias, you know. So there hasn't been a good randomized controlled trial with participants that have had a concussion looking at concussion recovery with creatine versus placebo.
Interesting. I would have thought that like the NFL, for example, would be super curious in anything and everything to do with concussive rehabilitation, and you'd think that that'd be an easy way to do creatine, but interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult kind of subject matter to study. Like,
Hmm.
yeah, you'd have to basically like get people that had concussions and put them on creatine or placebo. I know there are groups around the world that are trying to do it, but I think every concussion is so different. It's like it's
Hmm.
hard to tease out the small effects that creatine might have. But you know, if I had uh, somebody like family member that was involved in football or playing sports where you have higher risk of concussion, I'd probably take the risk of um,
Sure.
putting them on creatine because there's very little risk to that. They might actually get stronger and bigger muscles and perform better. And it might be protective and help with recovery from a concussion standpoint.
Hmm.
I'm hoping as Dr. Creatine that you have some sort of like Google News alert for any new creatine developments. So you might have seen this already, but a few months back, as Congress is debating the National Defense Authorization Act, something got into a House draft, I think. I don't think we have an FY25 NDAA, which is going to be a problem really soon because that fiscal year starts in a month. But at least in a draft of it, there are people on Capitol Hill considering a mandate to have the military explore putting creatine in MREs, into the field rations. Do you have any particular thoughts on that topic? I don't know how far down this rabbit hole you've gone, but
I did see that, and that was very interesting to me. And I think that'd be awesome. And yeah, I actually had the Canadian military reach out to me as well, and I did a webinar on some of the creatine concussion research for them and showed them what the research had to say. But there's interest, you know, from I think again, like the real risk of creatine is so small. Like a couple of people might get a little bit of GI distress, but the benefits of creatine are from a muscle perspective are there, and the theory to enhance their cognition and help with concussion recovery. The theory is there as well. There's good animal models to support that, and there's, as I mentioned, that one or two kind of open labeled creatine study in youth and adolescents to show benefits. So yeah, I think if you're the military and you want to enhance kind of the health of the individuals, then I would consider it, and yeah, it would be great to study it.
so I'll admit that my initial response. So if you're outside the tactical space, it might not make a ton of sense, but field rations are actually eaten pretty rarely by most service members. They're only eaten when you're doing like extended field training, and even then, you might still get some hot meals out in the field and things like that. So my initial reaction to it was this seems like a weird way to get creatine to service members. Like if you were going to do it, just supply it to them in the same way you would do normal supplementation. And the military is very weird about providing free supplements to service members. But what changed my mind was increasing my awareness of some of that sleep protectiveness stuff, and particularly the recent one on single dose still being protective for sleep. Because normally I would argue you don't eat MREs frequently enough to reach saturation from creatine in MREs, so it might be a waste. But if a single dose can have a dramatic impact on like retaining accuracy and things like that during sleep deprivation, that's exactly what's going to happen in the field. You're going to get sleep deprived and you're going to eat MREs. So that's where I came around on the whole topic.
Maybe they're on to something yet.
That's going to turn into like a bidding war, and you're going to get some like weird creatine product versus. Actually, let me ask you that: pills versus powders. Is there a difference?
There's no difference, but the creatine monohydrate powder is cheaper generally. So that's usually what I use and what I recommend. Yeah. And there's actually gummies now as well.
Creatine
Yeah,
gummies.
creatine gummies.
I
Yeah.
was going to ask about that. I couldn't find a single efficacy thing on the gummies, so I didn't know what to make of them. I Googled that as I was prepping for this and couldn't find anything. Is there any difference there? Does it matter?
So there's been zero studies that have ever tried to look at the efficacy of creatine gummies on exercise performance per se. There has been a few investigations of, do those creatine gummies actually contain creatine, similar to like, is it possible to put it into a liquid? And you can put it into a gummy, so they do actually have creatine monohydrate in them, which is, I guess, good news. So I don't think it would actually make a difference whether you consume it in a gummy form or powder form. But the gummies are much more expensive than the powder form, and yeah, they're very expensive right now. So you can afford that if you win the lottery, then yeah, maybe just get a couple gummies. But otherwise, just get creatine powder.
What other weird products have you seen with creatine in them?
I don't know, but I was thinking about maybe opening like a creatine store, and selling like creatine muffins or
Oh,
creatine
people would be.
pancakes.
Well, we saw that.
And
I remember it was a How I Built This episode, and they were talking to the Kodiak cakes guys, and they were like, "Yeah, we just put protein on the package, and all of a sudden they sold like crazy." It's like creatine's probably the next big thing. Just put creatine on stuff, and people buy the shit out of it.
So I do know in Europe they're actually creating like plant-based burgers, and putting creatine in it, because if you're on a plant-based diet, you get less creatine in your diet, and you might be more responsive to creatine supplementation. So they're actually putting creatine in these plant-based burgers.
That makes
So
sense.
yeah,
So
pretty cool.
for my answer I did do a quick Google of weird creatine products.
I mean,
And
gummies has to be up there.
well, it mostly brings up normal stuff, but the weirdest one I found, and this is not an ad, and I will not link this in the show
Wait,
notes.
you Googled weird creatine products? What website
Yeah,
is hosting this answer?
I'm not going to link, no
Oh,
free
that's
ads.
fair.
But most of the products that came up were pretty normal.
Except,
One is suggesting that creatine has unique booty building properties, and they sell creatine powder. It's creatine monohydrate powder. It's probably fine, but they sell it specifically in a butt-shaped tub. So I think that might be my favorite one.
I did see that going on Twitter as well. Yeah, I thought that was pretty funny.
is it like pink?
Well, it's marketed to I mean, it's like a pretty weird product to put on a shelf. It's marketed specifically for women, so it's just like a feminine like crotch with a big butt.
I've also seen creatine for dogs as well.
Hmm.
So it's suggesting that if you want to get your dogs jacked or something, then you can
I
you can
might
buy these
try that.
products, and you got
I
to
might.
Google search that one, creatine products for dogs.
I'll let Drew Google that briefly because he's got a dog.
I was gonna
But
say, I'm contemplating. I have a dog and I have creatine, so I might tomorrow get something started.
so to get this thing a little bit back on the rails as we come to a conclusion here, we've already used up an hour of your time. Is there anything we've missed in terms of like specific tactical relevance? I know you spoke to the Canadian military about the post-concussive stuff because TBI is definitely a big thing in the military, but Is there anything you've seen with specific relevance to the military that we haven't touched on here?
For the improvements in exercise performance, the benefits with sleep deprivation. There's also, I would say with mental fatigue as well, that you can get some benefits of creatine. And then there is some evidence that it could be a benefit in hot environments. So with regards to thermal regulation as well. So that might be kind of relevance as well. And I'm just working on a review. We actually just submitted it on the potential benefits of creatine in firefighters, but obviously that's very relevant to kind of military or tactical individuals as well.
So Dave DeGroot, if you're listening, I want to know what the heat ramifications are. We've had a heat researcher for the Army on a few times. I'll be consulting Dave for thermoregulation consequences of creatine supplementation.
Sounds great.
Can you real quick speak to kind of what's on the horizon for creatine research? Like what gets, I mean, as Dr. Creatine, what gets you excited about creatine research these days? Where are we heading?
There's a lot going on. So for sure in like clinical populations, Alzheimer's, for example, they have lower amounts of creatine within their brain or following a stroke as well. So they could potentially benefit from creatine supplementation. So those clinical populations are pretty interesting to me. I'm doing a golf study with
Oh yeah.
creatine. We're trying to look at like putting accuracy and how far you can drive the ball and things like that. So that could potentially be improved. I don't think the golf world's done enough with regards to kind of
Yes.
nutrition and supplements. They focus a lot on technology and kind of other gadgety things to improve their performance. But yeah, if we can find out we can market a creatine monohydrate to golfers, in the store that sells creatine pancakes and creatine muffins,
Yes.
and we can make a killing off this.
Listen, Alex, you can edit this out if you want, but I have this idea in my head because I love to play golf. And I have always thought there is not a supplement aimed at golfers. So I have a whole brand created. It's called Slice. We could sell creatine products under that. We can do whatever you want. I'm happy to engage in that venture with you because you're right. They're so into gadgets and gizmos, but no one's taking supplements. Huh. I'm so happy you mentioned that. I'd be remiss not to ask you this final question because again, you've clearly mastered creatine, but I would imagine that you also have some knowledge of supplements in general. You mentioned at the top creatine being like one of the most well researched. If you had to pick your top, we'll call it 3 to 5 supplements that you would take that you would consider to actually be effective, what would those be?
I try to stick to my 3 C's: caffeine, creatine, and carbohydrates. But
Interesting. No
there's
whey
there's other
protein?
ones on the horizon as well. Protein, you can get that from your diet. It's not a big deal. You don't have to supplement with it. But there's beta alanine
Hmm.
or beetroot juice or nitrates are of interest as well that can improve kind of mitochondrial efficiency and endurance performance.
You raise a valid question that I have to ask then, because you just said protein's fine, you can get it from your diet, but then you just said nitrates, supplements. I mean, you just said beetroot. Like, what about just eating arugula or beets or whatever,
That's
or spinach
gross.
even to get your nitrates? Like, why supplement nitrates versus not supplement protein? Where does that breakdown come for you in terms of dietary sources?
You would have to consume a lot of food to get enough kind of nitrates to get the benefits. So there's actually these little concentrated shots called beetroot juice, beet it shots, and you can consume those and get some benefits, but they taste awful. So that's kind of the problem with those things. So I don't consume them very often, but stick to the 3 C's
Three
as well.
C's.
Yeah, all
Yeah.
those nitrate beet supplement things seem to be still pretty expensive right now. Beet Elite and all those.
Because
Yeah.
Yeah.
just plain beets are gross.
Arugula is pretty good though. I make a mean like arugula
I
apple
don't know,
salad.
man.
So,
I'm kind of with Scott on this because I'd rather supplement my arugula and eat a steak than eat a bunch of arugula and take protein powder
well, when you come visit Colorado, which you'll eventually have to do, we're gonna have steak and then arugula salad, and we're gonna cover both bases.
and some creatine. Well, actually, one more then before you go. What is like the dumbest supplement The biggest waste of money.
I would say branched chain amino acids,
Got him.
Nice.
not necessary at all. And yeah, probably a ton of people waste a lot of money on them.
Interesting. Okay. Well, there you go. From Dr. Creatine himself. Well, all the way from Canada, thank you for coming on and taking the time to chat with us. I know you've probably answered these questions a bajillion different times, but for our audience, I'll say thank you.
Happy to be here. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Guys, thanks for tuning in to this week's episode with Scott Forbes talking about creatine. And I'll tell you what, I intentionally went into this episode a little bit blind because I assumed that a fair amount of the audience is sort of only tangentially familiar with creatine aside from putting it in their protein shakes. Turns out there's a lot of goodness around creatine, and I'd seen some of that research, but not all of it. We didn't mention this on air, but off air, were sort of chatting with Scott, and I feel like it's one of those supplements that just everybody should take all the time for forever, was my takeaway.
And I kept my comments to myself.
Unless you're 5 years old, maybe? I don't know. Do you not take creatine?
I think there are so many things people should be doing that they're not doing, and there are so many things people should stop doing that they're doing, that like saying a supplement is something you should take all the time forever. I don't know.
But would you rather take a multivitamin? Like, I guess my question would have been for him.
Creatine versus multivitamin?
Yeah, something like that.
That's a good question. I bet creatine comes out better because like multivitamins are ineffective for a ton of people.
That's what you hear all the time about how they're bullshit. But creatine's not. Maybe we're
interesting.
I'm curious if we could get him on board with a sleep study, though.
Yeah. Well, it seems like you're more focused on your new golf supplement.
Slice.
Plan. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
Have you trademarked it? Because you can't keep talking about it on the internet.
Well, that was the first time I publicly mentioned it. But yeah. So look, here's the deal. This was an episode that was intentionally designed to provide information. Some of this came from, as we mentioned, the fact that they're talking about putting creatine in MREs. But I think a lot more of it just came from the fact that in the human performance space, I would argue the two most popular things people are putting into their, I was going to say into their mouths, but into their shakers are whey protein and creatine. And so who better to go to have that discussion than Dr. Creatine himself?
And I'll just take a second to admit, and I mentioned it on air, but not very explicitly. When the NDAA language came out about creatine and MREs, I did post about it. I shared my opinions. They were only on stories, so they're probably gone now and stuff. And my initial take was that it seemed kind of stupid. And my reasoning for that was all the research I have seen suggests that creatine operates on a saturation mechanism. You have to like reach higher levels of creatine to see the benefits, and you reach higher levels by taking it consistently over time. And so putting it in MREs doesn't make a ton of sense because you're going to eat them for a few days or a couple of weeks, and then you're going to go back to not eating them. And like, let's be real, people don't eat every piece of the MRE. So like, who knows what piece they're going to put the creatine in? They're going to put it in the part that sucks, right? They're going to put it in like the whichever piece nobody wants to eat, and they're all going to throw it in the box that nobody eats, and like rodents are going to get it later in the field exercise. Who knows?
Sounds very specific.
I mean, anybody who's been to the field enough in the Army, especially if you're like me and spent a lot of time at the talk. Yes, I'm a pogue. You know that there's a box with all those discarded MRE parts that nobody wants. That's just the way it works. People don't eat the whole MRE unless you're like very, very hungry. But that's those people who need it, whatever.
Some bodybuilder is going to be in there taking everyone's creatine.
There you go. But to bring this thing full circle, it was that study we referenced about single dose creatine having a fairly significant effect on mitigating the effects of sleep deprivation that really kind of changed my opinion towards potentially supportive of putting it in MREs. That said, I think if we agree with the bulk of the arguments that Scott made in the episode, and we agree that creatine would be good for service members, we should be looking at ways to provide supplements to service members. And that way we can provide actually good supplements to service members rather than whatever they're buying at whatever store, including the ones where we let people sell shady stuff on base. And I think, and this is just a foreshadowing for future episodes, I don't know if we'll be able to get a person on who can talk about this because it's not done yet, but I think SOCOM is working on some policy so that they can use appropriated fund budget stuff to purchase supplements for their soldiers, for their operators, whatever you want to call it. That's SOCOM specific as far as I know, but might be coming down the pipe. We'll see.
I'm not surprised. I mean, as human performance gets bigger, the supplement conversation is going to keep coming up. Although I would be shocked. Maybe I wouldn't be shocked, but it's sad that I wouldn't be shocked if they pass legislation that allows the use of appropriated funds to buy supplements before food.
Yeah. Well, you can use appropriated funds to buy food. You just can't only use funds that were appropriated for food. That's the problem.
Right. But ask anybody how they get food for soldiers. It's through the chaplain.
Yeah, 100%.
So it's
unless you ask people whose job it is to provide food
Sure.
for soldiers, in which case that money was appropriated for that.
Of course.
We're doing this is a throwback to Chief
Mhm.
when we broke down the whole DFAC operation. Yes, it is a frustrating thing that human performance teams struggle so hard to put healthy food options in accessible places for service members.
Indeed.
That we agree on.
Indeed. But yeah, thanks for tuning in. Go and get yourself some creatine from Korea Pure, and we'll see you next week.
No free ads.
Hey, Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsinmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.